Hello, I'm Theo Lenormand, and today I'm gonna just, as part of my open research kind of commitment, I'm gonna give you the talk. I'm gonna record the talk I gave on Monday at the Actual Economic Society conference in Leuven. This was an in-person conference, the second one I was able to attend. So today what I'm going to talk about is an article I wrote about the fact that we are witnessing structural changes in North Wales hills in terms of fast, quick differentiation of farms and of hill farming in North Wales, and wondering as well what could be the impact of future Welsh agricultural policy and the context surrounding agriculture. So to do this, I'll base myself on a case study, a kind of case study approach. So just to quickly define what is hill farming, as well as the fact that we have different type of hill farming, which is kind of important. In Wales, hill farming and uplands are very, very important. They occupy a large share of the country and they cover a wide range in terms of landscape potentials. If you have a quick look at a map of the Welsh relief and of waterways, we can clearly see that we have very different altitude levels, but according to what we have in the definitions of most of the uplands or hill farming, it often relates to LFA, less favoured area policy, which takes a blunt approach in terms of altitude to characterize those uplands. But historically, those areas have also had some geophysical constraints that restrict their possible actual output, which is a challenge for them. And they have developed a specific use of the landscape to deal with those geophysical constraints that, in the scope of the past 20th century actual development, often meant specializing on beef and sheep farming. But this beef and sheep farming is quite specific as well, because there's a set of social and cultural value that is attached to it, and attached to the use and management of the landscape, which has been emphasized previously in a lot of the literature, and that we kind of emphasized as well in some of our previous answers to public consultations. Now I want to emphasize something very important, is that we have different types of hill farming, different types of uplands, because we're not at all the same kind of context if we're on the hills of close to the Vale of Clwyd, or if we are standing on the Cumbrian mountains, or if we are close to Snowdonia. We have very different types of uplands, and I'd like to say that I think we could split them in two. Those who are much more dependent in terms of grazing resource and access to the mountain land, which have a share of rough grazing with semi-natural vegetation over 30% of the landscape, I would say, and the rougher kind of geophysical conditions, agroecological conditions, and other kind of hill farming with a much lower proportion of rough grazing and usually kinder geophysical conditions. So usually as well, those areas are not isolated by themselves. They are connected and they interact with other farming areas and other economic activities which are very important, which makes us think that they are often related, for example, to the hills close to the Vale of Clwyd, with the dairy poorhouse, the core of the Vale of Clwyd, and for North Wales, like around Bala, for example, what I witnessed was very connected towards Snowdonia and the Snowdonia mountains. And you witness as well different types of pressure on those landscapes, depending on where people see it. There's a paper that has been done on the Scottish uplands, the Scottish hills, that showcased this kind of pressure in those intermediate landscape between the rough grazing, the mountains, the very rough mountain, and the valleys and the lowlands, where we kind of have some compromises that have to be met between conservation, preservation of the environment and of the culture and social values, as well as production, the economic activity that lead to a kind of pressure. And these pressures have been kind of rising over the last couple years, and I would say that COVID, Brexit, or now the Ukraine crisis tend to generate new pressures on this landscape, and we can talk about a squeezed middle, people that are to find possibly new ways of dealing with the farms. And it's particularly obvious when you start to look at the statistics, because you realize that there's a steep decrease in the traditional orientation of those areas in a number of those Welsh uplands, of Welsh squeeze meadows, particularly in North Wales and Powys, with drops in terms of number of suckler cows and beef and sheep farm and breeding ewes. So it seems that the orientation, traditional orientation, is fast evolving towards something else, or at least there's a process of differentiation happening. But what we propose today is to try to explore those. A quick landscape analysis has showcased that among those differentiations that we can witness, there's obviously some continuous beef and sheep evolution, as well as some poultry, some new high added value production like poultry, dairying, but as well out of farming activities like tourism or electricity generation, but as well as tourism or possibly afforestation in the future. Some papers seem to think that we can go towards afforestation. But there's also a question about the gradation between those areas, depending on the kind of agroecological constraints and conditions we face. North Wales has the strongest trend in that regard, as well as featuring the gradient that we kind of are interested in to try to see whether it has an impact. So it is particularly interesting as well from the social cultural value, with the importance of the Welsh language and the Welsh culture in this part of Wales, which is extremely strong. So we'll try to address 3 research questions that basically all revolve around the idea to try to understand this process of actual development happening in the intermediate hill areas, squeezed between the mountain and the lowland, and what is happening, what has been driving those evolutions, what made it possible, and as well, are there any differences between the different levels in the landscape, from the intermediate uplands to higher hills. For the methodology, I'll be using the agrarian diagnosis approach, which I'm not going to describe here because I talked about it a lot in previous videos available, but basically it's multidisciplinary, and the fact that you have kind of an holistic approach where you combine different approaches that try to understand the differentiation of the actual development process through the landscape, historic and socio-economic scope make it particularly powerful to understand the logic and processes of each production system and and understand what's happening in the process of actual development. So we will compare and contrast to gain and to grab a greater information to intermediate hill landscape that belong to 2 different areas. The Vale of Clwyd, so an area like that will be organized around the alluvial valley of the Clwyd river, and Bala, which has the which is the upper Vale catchment. Again, in both of those areas, we're focusing on the intermediate hills, so not necessarily the lowland or the low parts of the ecosystem, but those people that have access to this kind of intermediate hill aspect. Those 2 areas feature different gradient of agroecological conditions. So, for example, in the Vale of Clwyd, it's linked to a lowland, so the alluvial valley, and we have a long grazing season. We're based on mudstone hills, so relief is relatively smooth and relatively wide interflows, particularly compared to what we'll see what we have on the other side. The climate is temperate, but we have relatively shallow soils, and we tend to have a relatively low amount of clay in soils that will have a low, sometimes, except on the bottom of the valley in talwegs, a relatively water carrying capacity, which can be a problem over summertime and lead to some temporary drought or lack of water. You can even grow cereals in some part of the landscape, the flatter parts. You have some restrictions in terms of harvesting and silage, but as you can see, those are restricted to some of the spaces of the landscape, and you can still be dairying on some of the landscape with relatively high output system, but as well as finishing. Again, you have a gradient. As you get far away from the alluvial valley, conditions tend to be rougher, tougher, with more with harder kind of with harder, more difficult agroecological conditions. In Bala, you can clearly see that the picture is quite different. As I was telling you, we really have this second kind of type of uplands and intermediate hills connected to a much more important mountainous area. and you can see it's much rougher. There's much less space that is available to harvest and to grow fodder on, and the grass growing season tends to be shorter, linked to the climate, which is slightly different. And again, it's like much more difficult in terms of access to grazing as well, potentially. And you can, so on this landscape, you would focus mostly on beef and sheep, but producing stores, you would never see or very rarely see people finishing cattle out of purely this landscape. Again, you have a gradient going from the bottom of the alluvial valley to the mountain in terms of conditions that people can have access to. I'm not going to talk about the rapid process of differentiation that I witnessed in North Wales while doing my fieldwork. With the appearance of new enterprises, of new farm enterprises and new orientations that kind of developed really quickly in the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years. So maybe just to come back on the process of differentiation that came until 2003, what we witness is like farms were really incentivized to increase output and to grow and to focus on beef and sheep, which gave a relatively homogenous and pastoral landscape use. Homogeneous as well because you were gradually kind of munching on like on like the rough grazing on the mountain land and on the hilltops to increase the available to increase your amount of semi-permanent pastures that you would have access to. So you still with this process, there would have been the gradual disappearance of the crops and a more important role for like the grass growing. You would have very different types of farms being available on the landscape. So most of these areas would be breeding focused. All the more as you were climbing up, as you can see, they would have access to a lot more rough grazing and mountain ground. And as well less possibilities to reclaim the mountain, to reclaim the open rough grazing. And potentially be more restricted, as well as having a lesser potential for yield, etc., etc. So we had very different, in terms of agrarian system, if we look at the broad typology of farms in our two study areas using the agrarian system, we had like large family farms with, large family farms or estate farms that would have required possibly a lot more hired in labor. But they would have focused on beef and sheep as well, except you can see the numbers are quite different, and between our two areas we're not in the same levels of output out of the land, as well as access to the landscape. So you can see that clearly on Bala, most of the people would have access to some kind of mountain ground, which was not the case on the people that would be in the Vale of Clwyd hills. And it would be much more restricted in terms of woods, like under like the medium-sized family farm and small holdings would have access to this kind of landscapes. Again, I try to emphasize the fact that you could have very different kind of potential of production between the two areas, and it's particularly obvious when you compare the size of the farms at the start of our study area. Until 2003, we really had an endogenous growth of this farms making do with whatever land they had and expanding relatively little, at least in terms of stocking density, at least in terms of land per family worker. There was no big expansion move. People would would make do with whatever they had to before expanding. And they had more land than, for example, bottom of the lowland farmers, for example. Hill farming faced a tremendous change after 2000. They just benefited from all the tools. They just had benefited gradually from all the tools that allowed them to increase production and to make the best use of what the landscapes they had access to: four-wheel drive, balers, round balers and silage bales, etc., etc. And post 2003, things changed in terms of we're no longer supporting you to produce more, and there was a shift towards a more dual-side approach with an income support with the first pillar and the BPS, going gradually towards the BPS, and some agri-environmental payments, conservation-based subsidy, with a very much restrictions, prescription-based approach in terms of what people could do with rules on how you could use the land, and you would commit into long-term schemes. On the flip side, it's very important to see that from 2003 to 2013, the first pillar of the income support was based on whatever you produced in the past, your historical payments. But from 2013 it gradually went towards a flat rate approach, meaning you would get paid everyone would get paid the same per hectare. And as yields would still be in kind of in between conservation and production, farmers tended to lose a lot out of this. It's also interesting to look at the demand and the fact that the demand parameters change a lot between 2003, 2013 and from 2013 onwards. And opportunities out of farming adapted and kind of evolved quite quickly as well. So this would be like the evolution from 2003 to 2013. As I mentioned, the opportunities were more limited and the market around agricultural prices were for inputs and outputs were not as good for outputs. So people were kind of incentivized by doing so to increase in size, increase in carcass meatiness, weight, number of lambs per use, mostly linked to input use, rather than following other approaches or differentiating so much into other productions. Where we saw differentiation is the fact that some people really took up the trend of going for the second pillar subsidy and like going towards more conservation-based approach, those that had a lot of mountain land and that kind of needed this subsidy or could fit relatively easily in them. Sometimes with some consequences, reducing like the stocking density and number of animals, adapting slightly, but also some people taking up organic farming as subsidy gradually were more interesting. And the fact that most people would go into like some sort of agro-environmental scheme, whether it was the very constraining side of it or the low constraining side of it, it meant that we had a slight increase in diversity in terms of landscape by adding up some crops again to a landscape that was nearly all some kind of tillage to a landscape that was purely or nearly purely grass and semi-permanent pasture. But from 2013, things started to change quite a lot with the change in actual markets. You have to consider as well that inputs started to rise quite steeply from there on, but there were also other opportunities out of farming. And what's interesting is you had like a more capital-based selection on the uplands that took place. So if we're starting with the large farms, well, I should have said before that the organic farming kind of approaches would have been taken up mostly by large farms that would have a lot of acreage available. Mostly for reasons linked to the output possible out of the land, to build a relatively extensive system and still be profitable, or taking up a lot more land inside, making them actually go to the large farm kind of category, which was not the case before. So a big trend that really started from large farm was the development of the dairy spring calving movement. First, it's something that was kind of adopted, like a system that was first developed in New Zealand with a grass-based dairy system focused on grazing, with as much grazing as possible and milking the grass relatively. You had special animals, specially designed animals in terms of size, in terms of abilities, roughness, that would be relatively low animals that would be you don't need to care too much about, compared for example to a 10,000 litres dairy cow. Well, your yield would bite it up in half with the systems, but you could milk mainly out of the grass, have the cows very little during the year, and they would cost you a lot less, and your work productivity would be particularly high by the number of cows, the time you would spend on each cow. And this development gradually took up, gradually got to the hills and to uplands after really being trialled in the lowlands. It meant that it was often dealt with shared farming and joint ventures, kind of agreements, partnerships, etc. With meeting capital, meeting an able worker and sometimes working capital. And what happened often was a split between the high and the low parts of the landscape, meaning that, for example, the low part of the hills or the valley inside the large farms would be taken by the dairy, while the upper parts would be going to separate sheep holdings, sometimes with different views and focused on conservation. Later, those large farms or possibly estates are taking back land in hand from former medium-sized family farms to start some smaller units of this spring dairy calving or expanding existing units. Additionally, you still have some people that were organic, etc., that are still here, and you have a diversity in terms of strategy. A big trend, I would say, for medium-sized family farm was like amalgamation, continuous amalgamation. That could be also a strategy for some large farms, and trying to go more towards finishing, but along with trying to increase autonomy to deal with the input price rise. So that would mean adapting, for example, rotational grazing technique, etc., to try to make the best of whatever people had access to. I think it's a big trend on the uplands in terms of medium-sized family farm, this kind of approach that's been also incentivized by the extension services. But a lot of people, due to the fact that subsidies went down quite a lot, would also question themselves, and as we're reaching a time when a lot of succession was necessary, some people went out of farming. We were downsizing, possibly renting out, or reducing, their risk problem by rearing heifers for other dairy farms. So overall, or going into further production. So you had some people that would go out of fully risky farming activity with the beef and sheep kind of system and adapting other kind of productions to be able to deal differently and to have another production. I think it's important, I haven't talked about it, but the access to, for example, electricity generation or residential developments or tourism was very restrictive, and there's a capital selection around it, as well as a location selection because of planning rules, as well as which road you're close to, etc., which are very important. So not everyone can have access to it, and capital, not everyone can have access to it. Tenant farmers and people with low capital would tend to struggle to access those. But as some people felt the full brunt of the kind of lower subsidy price, and lower subsidy combined with lower prices still low prices on beef and sheep relatively, what it meant was there was some new differentiation that happened on this medium-sized family farm. Mainly going organic, maybe sometimes, but meant still relying a lot on subsidies, or autonomy, as I was telling about, but mostly as well poultry developments, or rearing heifers for lowland farmers that would have hyper specialized and would have no room, nor the capacity, and would try to increase again their work productivity by externalizing some of their farming system. And that's where upland farmers that are skilled in livestock management would come in, either for poultry or for rearing heifers. This kind of orientation, they could be very good at it because they know how to handle livestock, and they have often some element of the infrastructure which is required that is already on the farm, limiting the outlay necessary, particularly for heifers, not so much for poultry, which is extremely interesting. On small holdings, we notice a broader kind of differentiation, with more and more people maybe going into local productions, local food productions, short kind of domestic, short distance kind of selling, short supply chain. The problem being that it's kind of selective, and you build really gradually your customer base, which obviously creates some constraints, and sometimes you also have the problem of you notice that it's not for everyone, and it can be a struggle to pay for the rent as well. Also, there's a really kind of an opportunity-based approach here on who can have access to this kind of differentiation, because you might need a kind of small holding to start with from the family or something like that, and then find some people renting out the land in terms of opportunities that would be that for a low price, or that kind of wants you to farm it in a certain way. But you also had some local end production as well, that could be an opportunity, as well as a number of people that would have downsized, for example from medium-sized family farm or from full-time farming into part-time farming or renting out, etc., etc. Very importantly, on small holdings we notice a lot of these small holdings that also go towards residential housing, and that then can be rented out by those people now living there or using it as second home to farmers, to active, like overactive, more active farmers, let's put it this way. Sometimes with conditions, sometimes without condition. Right. So you notice that we still have kind of an amalgamation drive and an acceleration of the differentiation process. So within something that is still relatively green, because dairy farming is still green, poultry is still green, we have very different levels of input use as well as output use from the landscape. And a gradation, a stronger gradation in terms of use of the landscape between the low parts and the high parts. And it's kind of very striking, as well as worrying, because you have a number of farms that have disappeared, and I would say a weakening of the socio-cultural mesh that that is usually witnessed into those areas. I'm just going to go quickly on the economic performance. So I'm taking a family farm approach to economic performance. Because we consider a lot of this farming system that I'm going to present, of these archetypes, those are not actual functioning farm, but they represent like a mix of what kind of farms we can find, that try to be representative, but combines very different farms inside it. So I just had a range of legacy as well as new differentiation available that I'm going to compare. So all monetary values are in this pound sterling 2018, I'm just going to try to showcase to you as well the fact we have to keep in mind that a number of the systems are linked to a long-term kind of approach, with people investing some money, not on a 5-year return, but 10, 20 or a lifetime. So it's very important to keep in mind when you also see low returns and low economic production. So if we look at the added value per hectare, the economic value creation, new approaches tend to be over the traditional landscape use, so beef and sheep. So for example, the beef and sheep kind of production system tend to have a low added value, even when they have low cost, even if they're finishing. And organic doesn't have a really better added value than the other beef and sheep system, which is very interesting. And you notice as well that a number of those new development systems have a much higher input use per hectare and output per hectare compared to the more traditional kind of approach of beef and sheep, and sometimes as well a more kind of heavy land use intensity. You really have a big pro. So the best in terms of added value is clearly the dairy as well as the poultry farming per hectare. But you notice that local sheep farm as well as a local food beef and sheep tend to have relatively high added value. So the local food beef and sheep system is quite high in terms of input because it has a calf rearing activity as well, which obviously and it's based on a very small acreage, so it tends to have. It still tends to have like a relatively high output per hectare and a relatively high input consumption. You notice as well the struggle to pay the rent for most beef and sheep system, which is a real worry, because it means that the expansion of those systems in the past, mostly sometimes in renting land, and mostly by buying land, which has been incentivized by the land market structure as well as the subsidy system and like the tax structure, has meant that you cannot really explain it by the pure economic production, but when you start to look into other factors you can explain it. So the per worker analysis on the economic production is on the added value is like much more balanced across the different systems, which kind of takes into account the different type of land that people have access to and the different types of agroecological conditions people can have access to. You can see that you still have much higher added value per worker on the new developments compared to the old ones, but the beef finisher, for example, is now faring quite well compared to, for example, heifers rearing. But still, we notice that new developments clearly are over like more traditional kind of approach and beef and sheep based farm kind of approach. If we look at the actual income per family worker, so I had to modify slightly the way some of the share farming archetypes were constructed. because otherwise you cannot to be able to compare them between, from a family farm point of view. You notice that these new approaches really favor a reduction of the subsidy dependence compared to the more traditional kind of approach on finishing, on beef and sheep, be it organic or finishing, etc. And it's very interesting. You notice as well the kind of difference in terms of access to subsidy and second pillar subsidies that are likely to represent the future of Welsh agricultural subsidy in terms of farming system. So it's clearly linked to people that have mountain land or rough grazing into the system and not so much the others. And they obviously have a very much higher kind of subsidy dependence. But again, you have some people that are kind of squeezed in the middle, like for example the dairy efforts rearing. It's like doesn't have a lot of mountain land and it doesn't have a lot of second pillar subsidy. So in the future, if there's no more first pillar, it will struggle a lot more. And that's why as well you notice that now it can manage to have a much higher proportion of its income from the farming activity and rearing efforts, as well as having more security, because often those are linked to contracts and not on a risk like the market, have less market risk, I would say. You notice the very interesting side about the kind of local food system that tend to, and short like supply chain system, that tend to have relatively low subsidy dependence, as well as broilers and hence like systems that tend to have very little subsidy dependence. It's very endearing, but it's interesting as well to take into account the fact that some of the systems, particularly on local food, or for example when you're breeding animals, really take time to build up a business, trial innovation, and kind of find a balance. If you're ever buying one, it's even valid on some of the beef and sheep system or dairying. The kind of question of a balance that we're taking here is a bit flawed. I try to simulate a bit the future agricultural policy and what kind of challenging context we're looking at. So trying to compare a bit into the future, taking some assumptions in terms of prices for output, input and subsidies, while still taking a land-based approach for subsidies in terms of payments per hectare and a multi-tiered scheme which was kind of conservative, but the Welsh government has proved to be quite conservative in past scheme, so the assumption is relatively interesting to look at, because they tried as well to a clear goal was to try to maintain kind of the mesh of like farms in the rural areas. Admitted that's what it has been set into policy goals, and you notice that when you look at the simulation results with different scenarios showcasing different kind of context, and you notice that basically large farms, if we still have a land-based acreage, will still have a much more solid kind of actual income and higher actual income than small farms. And the small farms, even on local food, will have relatively low income, and that would vary still relatively a lot, even because of in the commodity market, etc. Even taking into account their specialized like kind of selling kind of parts, selling kind of pathways, and the new developments really kind of have a consistently maintain levels of income above the living wage in the UK, which is very interesting to witness, combined with the relatively low subsidy dependence which is maintained. And with this we clearly see the interest of splitting the sheep, like the conservation side, and having the production side for those that have large holdings in terms of income, because you can get really it's less holistic gestion management of the holding and the different parts economically, which doesn't mean it happens in real life, but it's particularly interesting in terms of income to do this. Okay, I'll just switch to the conclusion. It's already been quite long. So I think that Brexit and another shock will lead to further challenging conditions for hill farming communities. I try to emphasize it mostly in the simulation side, which I haven't fully talked about, and I think most people that would look at this video would be aware of the challenges we're facing with Brexit for Welsh farming, even for trade or like in terms of subsidy, which we're not fully aware of what's going to happen in the future. It's been shown by the previous research and extensive literature that the low-intensity beef and sheep grazing systems and semi-pastoral are important in the intermediate hill landscape, and dominated those areas and had social and cultural values linked to it. And clearly what I think I've I've seen through this research is the fact that small and subsidy-reliant farms are the most at risk of disappearing, and most at risk of disappearing if they do not have conservation subsidies, second pillar subsidies. And if they're not supposed in an adequate manner, that could be independent of acreage, and as well as the problems of selection to access to the end market. If you don't have an added value production that does a lot of added value per hectare, you will struggle. And this struggle is also found in new entrants, and this kind of new entrants, the fact that the main pathway for now for new entrants is like spring calving dairying, when people out of farming that do not come from a family background, with share farming, and it allows them to overcome several barriers while not changing so in depth the capital, like the wealth repartition, and not being it being still a relatively selective pathway and specific pathway. When I mean selective, I mean that very few people will end up, and after a relatively long time, with their own farm, which I think is a struggle as well. And I think what we're going to witness is a polarisation of the landscape, with this split between high intensity and this split between drivers around conservation and production. And I don't think that even for this area will absorb some of the new uses of the landscape. I think, for example, afforestation will not take up in North Wales, given the dynamics that we're witnessing in other productions than afforestation. But clearly, if there's afforestation, it will only be some people that will benefit from it. Again, not small or medium, like relatively small-sized and medium-sized family farms. So, in the future, the Welsh Government may wish to ensure that the sustainable farming scheme and the wider regulatory and market policy context are sensitive to the combination of pressures that those upland and intermediate hill face. The challenge, I think, for this area would be how to maintain a coherent, livable and multifunctional mix of farm enterprise and related land management, which we will struggle in the current uncertainty context to get to. I think that's all. If you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. My contact details are in the last slide. If you want to have more resources, you can have access to my website. Thank you very much.